do. First question. The rise of agile methods coincided with a drop in popularity for architectural practices. Why do you think that is, Grady? If you may kick this one off for us.
Well, see, being a contrarian, I disagree with the premise of the question, which is that we saw a drop-off of architectural methods. No, perhaps it was a little bit more vocal, but through the entirety of software, there has been this balance between architecture upfront and architecture later. Let's look at some history. Remember that the waterfall paper by Win Royce was published in 1970, and it's often misunderstood because Win was not celebrating our waterfall. He was offering an alternative. And even then, he was observing that the hardware techniques of upfront requirements and design were inappropriate to software. And we saw that back in that time. David Parnas wrote his classic paper in that same year, A Rational Design Process, Why and How to Fake It. And even then he was talking about the need for a balance between incremental architecture versus upfront architecture. So yeah, I disagree with the premise that all of a sudden Agile came onto the scene and nobody cared about architecture anymore. Nobody cared about architecture before then in the ways we tend to deal with it today. And it has always been a debate. What changed is, I think, twofold. First, the nature of the software we were developing was changing in that time frame. Remember, here we were in the 80s prior to the internet, but we were deep in the midst of the PC revolution. And so there was now a great move toward lots of client server things and lots of things on the PCs themselves, which by their very nature, users had no idea how to use them. So there was a need for incremental work. So I think the noise came a little bit up saying, oh, no architecture. But much like Win, I think they were misunderstood.
Well, I would partly agree to that. Yeah, so from my perspective, we have still a knowledge gap in relation to the architectural concepts, practices and methods which are available. Yeah, Grady just mentioned then the popular articles by Parnas, for example. Yeah, so they are not in the industry very well known. Yeah, and so is that also with the methods, practices, and also the basic concepts. Yeah, so I think we definitely have to engage in this transition, yeah, and make the stuff which is available much more transparent and usable. Another perspective on that is maybe that the agile methods are rather, I would say, silent on the architectural topics. Yeah, so some of them they mention to that. They have also some concept in there, but they're definitely not referring to everything that is available that was developed before, and a lot of that stuff is still useful for today. And from a practical view, I think a third perspective on that would be there are still some misconceptions about Agile and the Agile methods, yeah, and particularly looking on the 11th principle of the Agile Manifesto, yeah, where this idea, so that an architecture emerges and so on. That is, from my experience, misinterpreted a lot of times, yeah, where people completely skip the architectural topic, or they simply rely on a bunch of self-organizing teams that then suddenly an architecture pops up.
And Stefan, I mean, I'd like to add a few things. I think it's also what we mean by architecture. And as someone who's worked and consulted with large organizations, I think architecture sometimes has the connotation of something that is done to the team rather than the team doing it, or it's done by another group of people rather than the team. And I think there is a natural reaction to that, which is also kind of related to what Grady said about the big design up front, or the infamous ivory tower architecture view. There are certain people that stand out there, they decide the big decisions, and because they're the important people, and then everyone works within those confines. So I think there is a natural reaction to that. And what I really like about Agile in general is the importance of the team and the team collaborating on things, because as we know, every system has an architecture. It's how it evolves, how it's articulated, and how it's, you know, developed by the team, which is one most important. So I really think there's that view, and I do feel that architecture does go up and down in terms of its importance. And with Agile, there has been, you know, I guess I'll disagree with Grady on that, but there has been a perception that architecture is less important. But I think that's more of almost a power play between the people who might be ivory tower architects and the teams doing the development.
And I think there are different approaches to architecture, which I consider then as those, let's say, fundamental concepts. So, for example, referring to George Fairbanks, so he has this categories of, so you can, let's say, completely ignore the architecture. So the architecture, they're still there, but you simply let it go, let it happen. Or you could really then proactively engage and design your architecture, or you can even completely build that in. And that is for me also, let's say, part of those fundamentals. So there's no one size fits all or a single approach to do architecture. And you need to build up the capabilities in your organization, in your team, to really decide consciously how you want to engage with that, depending then, of course, on a lot of factors, the project size, the problem domain, and whatever is then driving that decision.
So we've said our architecture has come in and out of importance, I think it was said. Whether or not that's due to the rise of Agile is obviously debatable. What we are seeing increasingly, though, recently, is that Agile methods are having an opinion on architecture, particularly scale methods like SAFe. So are you guys happy with what you're seeing in the Agile methods around architecture? Perhaps, Murat, you want to kick this one off?
So to be honest, if I looked into each Agile method and done a critique of how they're focused on architecture, the answer is no. And I think you're right. It is not central to the way they're at least perceived and trained and delivered, right? And as you said, SAFe does have more about architecture with architecture runways. I guess, I mean, I'll do a quick pitch on our book, and the reason we named our first book Continuous Architecture and Continuous Architecture in Practice, because it's really about is really bridging that chasm between let's just get things done and just as Grady said, let's just go to the code, versus let's have a 10-year plan, right? And then there's some happy medium in between. And what we say in continuous architecture is just a set of principles. It's focus on products, focus on quality attributes, delay design decisions until the appropriate moment. There's lots of I think good things we can learn, but the problem is we should never over formalize things, right? I think that's the big, yes, we can add more architecture into SAFe or less or other things, but it's really what works for the teams, and each team has to decide, almost pick from a set of practices and what works for them. That's the most important thing. Otherwise, we end up, for the reasons we talked about, why architecture can be perceived as non-important, or is because it's imposed on you. It's a formal structure imposed on you. You have to do this, you have to do that, you have to comply with that, rather than something that the team embodies. And from what I understand, that's a little bit what Essence is trying to do as well, right? What are common practices? How can we pick from the ones that we think are important for our team or for our small organization? I think that's really important. It's good to have a smorgasbord of practices, architectural practices, and the teams decide what works for them. And I think that's most important, rather than over formalizing it in a process.
Yeah, I think if you look into the various Agile methods, they definitely have this opinion or this idea of establishing, then some call it an architectural runway, or it's architectural runway or skeleton, yeah, whatever. So some sort of architecture which you then use to deliver then the features, the stories, the requirements, right? And this relates then to this design style of doing, as Murat mentioned, an evolutionary architecture or an incremental architecture. So we are not building that upfront completely. You're more like evolving than the architecture. However, so there is also, let's say, this finding that a lot of solutions are currently not deployed or, let's say, developed from scratch. Yeah. So you usually have some standards, or you use then some frameworks, some solutions, yeah, to develop then your own solution. And those solutions bring in some architectural patterns. So there is partly architecture built in. So I would argue it depends. Yeah, so from time to time, when you can really reuse those solutions and you bring a lot of architectural patterns in there, the problem kind of shifts, yeah, to making sure that the various solutions you combine work together, and you don't have to build your architecture from scratch. And sometimes it makes sense, yeah, to really build more stuff at the very beginning, because you just reuse some of those pre-built components.
Problem I have with the idea of an architectural runway is that by the time you get at the end, you may discover that you really didn't need an airplane, you needed a boat. And so it's problematic. Little side story here, because I know Ivar is fond of these backstories. Where does the idea of architectural runway come from? It comes from the SAFe methodology. Where does SAFe come from? It comes from a little company led by a guy named Dean Leffingwell. Where did we hear that name before? Well, Dean was introduced to me by Ed Jordan many decades ago. And Ed said, Ed of software architecture fame with structured methods, said, hey, Grady, you ought to go see this guy. He's doing some cool things with regards to requirements analysis. So in our frenzy at Rational to acquire organizations, we bought Dean's company. And for the longest time, Dean was actually, in theory, our manager, right, Ivar? He was our manager, but we had a great relationship with him. We assumed he was trying to manage us, and he assumed we were manageable. So it was a good relationship. But back to the idea of the architecture runway, SAFe is interesting because they're one of the few methodologies that I think is trying to be explicit about it. But if you dig into it, it's the same old incremental iterative ideas way back from the early Rational days, way back from the days of Barry Bain's spiral model, which, by the way, was when was that published? 1988. So these ideas are not new. What's different, I think, and what's forcing the discussion is we have a multitude of organizations who are moving into microservices, and not just directly, but also moving from monoliths to microservices. And so for some, they can still punt the architecture decision. We don't need no stinking architectures because all we need to do is microservices. But of course, they neglect the notion that the choice of a set of microservices is an architectural decision unto itself.
And one more thing just to say, I mean, when we talk about architecture, I think we always focus on the structures and the systems and the relationships. But part of architecture, or doing architecture, is communication and collaboration. And I think that's very important, that we should, as Grady said, explicitly state the decisions you're making, and make sure that you can communicate to your team members and other teams as required. So I think that's sometimes a forgotten aspect, and just focus on architectural decision records, which is becoming very popular recently. I think is very important from that aspect, because you can say I'm doing microservices, you can say I'm doing 5, I'm doing 10, I'm using this database technology. Whatever the decision is to make that explicit and visible over time as well, not just with the team, so that the future team members can also understand. I mean, how many times have we been in projects when people said, why did we do this? It sounds like a ridiculous idea. And everyone says, I don't know, Joe was here or someone else was here and he decided it was a good idea. So that aspect, I think, is very, very important.
And I think, Murat, that is also related to one point I'm actually not happy with. Yeah, so the point is, so the methods talk about this architectural runway. Yeah, so all this walking skeleton. But for a lot of systems, yeah, the main question is, so how is that, let's say, being designed? Yeah, how is that, let's say, created? And depending then on the architecture or the problem domain, you need to spend a lot of time really coming up with this runway before then your products, your feature teams can get productive with that.
Yeah, and some of this is also probably organizationally, how you're set up, like, to have runways or operate, as you said, there's a certain organizational structure, that you have to, and some organizations might thrive in that, some might not, so it's really, I think that's, the impact of organizational structure on architecture and how just systems evolve in corporations is quite a separate and very interesting topic.
Yeah, agreed.
So we've talked about things like runways, which are obviously unsafe. Some other agile methods have their own opinions on architecture. If it were up to you guys, how would you want to see architecture practices and approaches embedded in agile methods? Like we talked about the architecture decisions becoming more popular recently. Is that something you would want to see in some agile methods, that explicit, or maybe Murat, again, since that point was around you, what would you want to see in agile methods?
I mean, I think there's 4 what I would call essential activities of architecture. If you do nothing else, you should do these. And how you do them, you can decide on how. But one is focus on architectural decisions. So make that explicit. Communicate to know why you made decisions. The second one is focus on technical debt. Understand the technical debt you might be creating or you're removing, and be able to explain that in a way that your business stakeholders can understand. The third thing is drive your architectural decisions by quality attributes or the non-functional requirements. That's quite important, because that's what breaks or makes an architecture lots of times, is to know what I guess quality attributes you have to deal with. And the other one, and which I think relates to Agile, is implement feedback loops, right? They're just feedback loops from your, from your tests, from your architectural decisions to the running product. There's concepts like fitness functions, which are quite good, that enable you to get feedback loops. So I think those are the key things. Now, how you would want to formalize them or not in any Agile approach, I think is up to I guess the people that develop the methodologies and people that implement them. But that's my view, and is that those are the 4 essential activities of architecture. And if you do those, get those right, your product that you're developing will, the architecture will evolve with the product rather than being done up front or totally forgotten about.
Well, I think it's not really about the question how to embed the architectural concepts and so on into the agile methods. I think we should more, let's say, focus on how can we compose, for example, an agile method with an architectural practice or method or concept that is already available. So it's really more about what essence is, let's say, supporting that you can in a flexible way compose various practices and methods in a way that brings your endeavor, your project, your team forward. And it has also, let's say, has a lot of relationship to this idea of knowledge and engineering, that you don't want to start everything from scratch. You should combine the new way of working by using stuff that might be in use for 10 years. And if it's still valuable, you can continue with that. And there might be also other new stuff which you can use. And particularly looking on the architectural practices and methods, I think those are prime candidates, for centralization because you would typically use those then in various projects. Could that be agile, hybrid, or even plan-based or whatever? Of course, you won't use everything in every combination, but you need to build up the capability to flexibility, combine your own method.
Great feedback. Grady, do you have, what would you like, how would you like to see architecture either embedded or composed alongside agile methods?
My issue primarily is one of scale. So I have no problem with agile methods that punt architectural decisions, because for many of the smaller projects, architecture is not particularly important, to be very honest. Most of their major architectural decisions have been cast by their choice of frameworks. Once they have done that, then everything else becomes very domain specific. So in the small, I don't really care about architecture for small teams. It's when those teams come together to build a product, then it becomes relevant to me. So in a way, to say, what should be the relationship of agile and architecture? Well, yeah, there should be one, but it's more interesting when I start worrying about less so the agile team itself and more so where that agile team fits within the business and within the industry. Then architecture becomes interesting, because it is then economically interesting for me.
And it supports then, as Murat mentioned before, the communication. And when you're scaling up then your organization, your development team, then this communication perspective kicks in, and you definitely need then something, and the architecture is one part of that. Not the only thing, of course, but it's a very important part. For example, giving you guidance in relation to your team setup, how you structure the team, how you split up the work of the team, and so on.
Yeah, great points. And I just want to bring in the poll results here. I'm not sure how you guys can see it, but on my screen it says the audience can see it, so hopefully you have a way to do so. And it relates to what you guys have just been talking about. So one of the second question, how do you rate the role of architecture in agile methods? 87% of you said important. And then the third question, looking at both of them, is really interesting. What would you say the maturity level of architecture is in your organization? And we have only 16% with a high, and 50% of you said average, 32 said low. So we seem to agree that it's very important, but we're not very mature at it. So yeah, it's interesting finding the balance of being descriptive about what to include in methods and how you go about doing it versus, letting it emerge naturally, or, letting the teams decide what's important to them with something like Essence. So the next question I have for you guys, organizations often struggle with applying agile methods at scale. What are some of the common pain points that you see when an organization tries to adopt agile methods in larger projects/products development? Stefan, maybe you want to share your thoughts on this one?
So, of course, there are various challenges. When you scale up, then your agile endeavor. Focusing on the architecture, I see a few points, typically, which really represent some challenges for the company. So first of all, as I said before, the team struggled to build up this runway. So they built up this piece of architecture of the solution, which you can then use to deploy and feature stories, you name it. The second one is the team spent more time on fixing. So you really have a lower throughput in relation to your stories, to your requirements, because the team is focusing on fixing stuff. And the next one would also be related to this communication. So there's one phenomenon, which you can see. So the teams work on the various components, yeah, and then you really struggle to bring all the stuff together, yeah, and you have a lot of defects in relation to this integration, yeah, because then suddenly you see this component isn't working then with the other component. And of course, coming back to the technical debt discussion, yeah, Murat brought this up. You see then there is some refactoring requirement popping up suddenly, yeah, or you could also say you accumulate technical debt, yeah, and of course, how could companies deal with that? Yeah, I would simply argue, okay, use the existing architectural practices and methods, yeah, to deal with that. That is for me an indicator that is something wrong with the architecture. But of course, there are a lot of problems and challenges, yeah, when you scale those agile methods.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking about, I mean, implement in large organizations, having one who works and has worked in them for a long time, you know, applying anything at scale is difficult in those organizations, right? It's not just about agile, and agile's, I guess, why it's really the beauty of it is the focus on the team to be able to do things quickly. You know, it's, you know, people and interactions over, you know, processes and tools, etc. But whenever you try to do something at scale, you have to implement processes. You have to have some common things, and that I think that's just a natural tension between what you want to achieve with agiles and what organizations want to impose and probably have to impose, right? Because you just can't have any large organization where everyone does what they want. So I think that the trick is about figuring out what are the right constraints, you know, that teams have to deal with. As Grady said, if you pick up framework, your architecture is done. So in large organizations, they're given certain constraints. You might have picked your cloud provider for you, or in the old days, they would have picked the database technology you have to. So there's certain things that are given to you, and be very clear what those things are. They could be technical or more process oriented, and still enabling teams to I guess, innovate within those constraints. You know, so that's, I think, a key aspect.
May I ask a question of all of us? What is scale? When does one shift from things not of scale and things of scale? How do you all measure that?
Okay, I'll take a stab at it. Good question. There's, I guess, there's two aspects of scale, or maybe three. But one is just team size, right, and the number of people in the organization. So as you can say, if you're a startup with 10, 20 developers, or, you know, certain things, that you're at a low scale, and then if you go into the hundreds and thousands, that's the larger scale. I think there's also scale from the platform you're developing. So if you're developing I don't know, low latency trading application, your scale considerations are much more different than if you're dealing with a general ledger system, you know. So there's the scale in terms of the system you're providing, the number of users, the number of transactions, and things like that. So I would say those are the two main dimensions.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I think from the architectural perspective, of course, yeah, there's team size, yeah, because you need to support then the communication. When you scale up, you also need to scale up then the communication. As Murat said, also the complexity of the problem domain or the solution. Yeah, so some solutions are quite easy, but usually when you scale up, yeah, also the complexity increases. And another important perspective on that is also, let's say, the average skill of a team member. Yeah, so typically when you have small teams, yeah, and you have really top-notch people working on that, that will be different when you scale up than your endeavor, yeah, because then you will also have, let's say, junior people on board, and you need to, let's say, support this mixed teams, and you need to, let's say, balance then the different skill sets you get into that. Yeah, and architecture, for example, is one way, yeah, to structure that or to support that. And then, of course,
to that end,
yeah, sorry.
sorry, go ahead. Finish.
No, go ahead.
To that end, I'm reminded of an early encounter I had with Kent Beck. So Kent of XP fame, which really was one of the earliest Agile methodologies, and Kent and his methodology were very influential in the growth of Agile methods. We had a very direct discussion about architecture in the early days of his work. And I finally came to the conclusion that one of the reasons that architecture was not that important for Kent was twofold. First, this is a brilliant guy, and he had within his head a myriad of design decisions that he already knew because he had built a bunch of these things. And so he didn't need no stinking architecture because he knew what he needed to do already. And the other thing was he was working in a domain that was like I described earlier. It tended to be on the client side, the front end side, where there was already a lot of experimentation. And so there were also not a lot of frameworks around in that time frame. So that very situation demanded experimentation and the absence of an architecture up front. It's those two things that I think that spurred his work. If you go back and talk to Kent today, he will tell you that architecture is very important. One of the things that transpired with Kent since that time frame, he worked for Facebook for a while. And one of his jobs was try to inject some discipline / architecture into what Facebook was doing. He eventually gave up and left the company. But that's another story.
We had Kent Beck on our meetup last month, funnily enough.
CA22, the IA is not getting bench sooner, so for the initial builds, they would be interested in it.
I think we had someone who left the microphone on. Yeah, we had Kent Beck on last month, which was great to hear opinion. Perhaps we'll get you guys back together in the future so we can have an update of that conversation you had a while ago.
I would enjoy that. That would be fun.
Definitely. I'm sure the audience would as well. A follow-up question to the scaling topic. So obviously large organizations, they have many struggles when they scale. One of the common struggles is just creating a common ground, because you're trying to communicate with a much larger group of people. Being on the same page with a much larger group of people will naturally just become exponentially more difficult as people have their own ideas, biases, notions, incorrect or not, about whatever you're trying to create a common ground for, like architectural practices or agile methods like Scrum. And so the more you scale, the harder it tends to become to keep everyone on the same page. And it makes communicating quite difficult as well. Like, how do you communicate with someone else in the organization if they may have a completely different idea about what you're communicating about? The word is the same, but the meaning could be very different. So do you guys see this as a problem with scaling architecture in organizations? And if so, how do you sort of go about addressing it, or how do you think it could be addressed? Stefan, do you want to kick this one off?
So I think typically when you scale up and you have a lot of teams, yeah, so you don't want to constrain then the various teams on their methods, yeah, and that is true for the architectural methods and practices, and also for, let's say, everything that is used beyond that. However, in order to support the collaboration, you need some common ground, yeah, you need some common language. Yeah, and that is again where developer position of essence kicks in. Yeah, so assume that you have those methods described on essence. You would have this common ground, yeah, where a single team can customize and shape their way of working. Yeah, however, there is a layer on top of that where the different teams collaborate with each other, but they need to speak a common language. Yeah, they need to have some common ground, and you typically see that, for example, with the large cloud providers. Yeah, so where the various teams, yeah, they are rather independent. Yeah, however, you need to bring those teams together. Yeah, and that's why I think then we need something beyond, yeah, the existing description of a method, for example. Essence is a prime candidate for that. Yeah. However, yeah, and I think we will pick that up later. There are also still some impediments in relation to Essence.
Stefan, with respect, that's not just an issue that Essence cares about. It's every organization that's trying to build things at scale care about that kind of thing. And this notion of a common language and a common understanding is critical, which is why, if I circle back to the notion of frameworks, why those are so important in the decision process, because the very decision to use a framework immediately introduces a shared experience and a shared platform. They are now the new, if you will, operating system. In fact, do you go even further? If I were to say, I'm going to go with AWS versus Azure, wow, you just made significant architectural decisions by having gone down that path that are often irreversible design decisions, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The notion of being able to build a system that cuts across clouds, it's BS. Cloud strategies are the Roach Motel. Once you go in, you never leave.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I'm thinking about scale, a totally different thing is like, what do they say? They say the number of meaningful relationships a human being can have is like 100, 150, I think is the number that's quoted. You know, beyond 150, you need other mechanisms. You know, that's why we have societies. That's why we have, you know, parliaments or other ways of organizing ourselves. And most of our organizations are larger than 150 people. So I do agree that, you know, communication is important. And, you know, I guess Grady's point is great, because what you say is you can make certain decisions that makes at least, yeah, if you're talking AWS, then everyone's developing on AWS, you at least have a common language on that dimension. You know, then there's the dimension of common language from just the business perspective. So, you know, I think some of the domain-driven design techniques are great for that, of how to, you know, think about it and create, you know, what they call the ubiquitous language in a certain area. But, and I think from, you know, Essence is a great approach of trying to, you know, distill the basic practices you would have in software development, and maybe architecture, some of those architectural practices in the future. So it's a very noble cause, common language, etc. But it's almost in the nature of the size of the organizations that we deal with, that it is a continuous challenge and has to be continuously dealt with.
Great insights, thank you. So talking about communication and things like Dunbar's number and the challenges associated with being on the same page, some would say Agile has been so widely adopted that it's lost its meaning. We all tend to have very different opinions on Agile these days, and it seems, as an industry, it seems a bit fragmented, at least from my view. We don't also seem to learn much from what's been done before. There's a lot of reinventing the wheel, a lot of, doing it in a slightly new flavor, some different words perhaps, but the same old concepts. Do you guys agree with this? Do you think that the same applies to architecture perhaps, as in reinventing the wheel, not leveraging all the good practices and knowledge that's already there? Grady, perhaps you want to kick this one off?
Well, the one way we see the transformation is people move from one job to another. That's how we see experiences in one architecture move about, especially in the Valley. I mean, let's face it, that we have come to the place where a lot of the kind of software systems that people are building are not especially architecturally novel anymore. That if I say, I want to build a web-facing system at scale, we sort of know how to do that. And it's a matter of saying, well, yeah, I choose these particular frameworks and I need these things. So that's great, because it means that the industry has begun to codify a set of design decisions in those design decisions through the frameworks. Are they the right ones? Well, I don't know if they're the right ones, but they're the ones that work. And as an engineer, if it works, it's useful. So it is what we have. What's curious to me, and what validates us even further, is the same experience is happening in the artificial intelligence community. About 2 years ago, I predicted that there would be a book out on machine learning design patterns, and there exists one today already. We see the emergence of particular kinds of architectural styles for deep learning systems. The transformer is a common architectural pattern that fits within natural language processing. So what's fascinating is that the deep learning community is rediscovering all the things that we have been talking about here today, and they're going through this process. What's also interesting is they too are beginning to develop a language, if you will, for expressing these common kind of decisions. So this is, to quote Thanos from the Marvel Universe, it is inevitable. I will not snap my fingers at this moment, however.
We don't need
For those
to
of you who
erase
don't
half of
understand
us.
the MCU, then you should go watch the Avengers.
All 12
Anyway.
films of the Avengers.
All 12, yes.
There's a lot of them.
Right.
Murat, Stefan, any thoughts from you on that?
I agree with Grady, yeah, in relation to this, let's say, statement that not everything is really completely new. Yeah? So today you pick up a framework or solution, some open source component project, whatever, and a lot of architectural patterns come within that. Yeah? However, as soon as you scale up and you use not only one framework, and you combine that with some open source, with some commercial product, whatever, there are architectural problems popping up again, but on a higher level. Yeah, and you have this topic of impedance mismatch, yeah, where you, for example, have various patterns, yeah, in one solution, and you have other patterns in the other solution, and you want to combine that. So I think the point is the architectural work isn't then gone completely, yeah, but it is, let's say, shifting maybe to another level. Yeah, you are more reusing stuff, pre-built components, framework, open source projects. But as soon as you combine those, you have this architectural topic again. And the same is true from my perspective also on enterprise architecture level, or you can call it systems of systems. Yeah, when you are not, and as we are talking about scaled agile, not talking about one solution, but you're talking about a set of solutions, yeah, which then deliver some value for the business by collaborating and working together.
And just one final comment on that is just, I mean, software development is such a, I guess, young profession, and actually it's growing, you know, I don't know if it's exponentially, but growing very large in the number of practitioners. And it's a huge number of people coming in. I think in generally, at least from the industry, what's taught at the universities, that doesn't really help that much in you know, applying that knowledge and developing systems, at least in corporations. So there's a, so actually, I think compared to other professions, it doesn't transfer knowledge from generation to generation as successful. You know, that's just, I think maybe because it's so new, right, in the scheme of history. But I think that is just, it's inevitable, as Grady said. So that is a, yes, I think we do come across same problems, and you know, and you go to cloud platforms, and if you look at how you do disaster recovery, well, actually, it's not that different than how you do disaster recovery in with a server and two databases or whatever, right? It's just some of the frameworks and context has changed, but you're still dealing with the same problems over and over again. But solving, I think there is, you know, not, but the tools you have to deal with them are more advanced. And I think open source, Stefan mentioned, as we probably overlooked, has been a huge impact on how people develop software and give people tools and frameworks and libraries to deal with that, which I think has been very valuable for the industry.
Yeah.
So you mentioned it's a young profession, so I'm sure it has a bright future. What do you think that future is? So what do you think the future of architecture looks like, both as a profession and maybe how it integrates with agile methods? Murat, do you want to give us your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and we've been talking about this with like my co-authors as well, and it's the big thing: is architecture a role, a profession, or is architecture a skill? You know, and that's, I think, you know, our views, it's becoming more than I am an architect. There's a skill that everyone has, but I'd be interested in others' views.
So I would definitely argue that we need to tackle this knowledge gap. Yeah, so there are a lot of concepts, practices, and methods available, but from my experience, they are not broadly known. Yeah, and we have to deal with that. We have to make those methods and practices much more transparent, reusable, and available to the broader community. And Essence might be the way forward to that. Yeah. And yeah, we need to move into this engineering discipline. Yeah, and that is, I think, the same situation as with software engineering and software development. If you look into this method and practice space of software engineering, it is not really engineering. Yeah, it is more like there is some new method, yeah, and that's then supposed to be the one-size-fit-all method, and a lot of organizations throw away all the other stuff and then they jump to this one. Yeah, and probably 6 months later there is also a newer method popping up, which is then used. Yeah, so we need to enable the organizations and teams to deal with this constant flux of change. However, they also need to be enabled to adopt those practices in a way that supports them. Yeah, and that's definitely not one size fits all, or I'm jumping on the next train here and 6 months later there's a new method train.
Picking up on the engineering metaphor, I have always viewed our profession really to be an engineering one, because it attends to a balance between art and science, but most particularly as an engineer, the balance of forces. We build systems that are not perfect, but we build systems that are optimal for the forces that weigh upon them. To go meta for a moment, what are the forces upon our industry? There are at least 4 that I see weighing upon us that will shape that future. And by the way, dear listeners, you are the ones who are going to create that future. That is my challenge to you. Not necessarily in any order of importance. The pendulum keeps swinging between edge and cloud. Today it has been toward the cloud. It is moving back toward the edge because of devices like this. This is an NVIDIA Jetson Xavier. It is basically a couple of Cray ones in a box for about $400. And the computational power here is awesome. This is the development board, and the board itself is actually the size of about half the size of a playing card. So with that kind of computational power, we are seeing a lot of interesting movement of especially AI things toward the edge. And we as an industry don't know how to do that yet. So that's one, the pendulum swinging. The second is that the growth of microservices is an architectural problem unto itself that is yet not fully explored. People say, oh, microservices, yay, yay, that's going to solve all our problems. But as I mentioned earlier, it neglects the notion that the choice of microservices is an architectural decision. That's 2. Number 3 is, it is always fun to look at shiny objects, and we often think of architecture in that regard. But remember that Google is a legacy company. Facebook is a legacy company. The IRS still has code running in the tax system written in IBM 360 assembly language. Architecture applies to these legacy systems as well. And so every system, as I've often said, has an architecture. Some of them are accidental, some of them are intentional, but they have an architecture. So increasingly, the challenge for these kinds of organizations, even the FANGs of the world, is how to deal with keeping your architecture vibrant in the face of the capital investment of all this software. This is the innovator's dilemma, and I think it will increasingly become so, especially if you turn out the noise of all the venture capitalists in the Bay Area, because it's a real architectural issue. So I think it's those things that will continue to shape what we're doing here. Where that future will lead us, I don't know, but in ways, to circle back to what I said at the beginning, what Wynn was seeing back in the 1970s There's nothing new under the sun. Architecture is important. We often don't care about it, but boy, we can't avoid it. One of the nice things about being old is you remember the past.
Yeah.
And damn, am I old.
Very poignant. Thank you so much. Guys, it has been 45 minutes of stimulating discussion. I'm sure the audience are dying to ask a few questions themselves. So if anyone from the audience has a question for our gentleman, now is your time to shine. Feel free to unmute. You can use the chat and I can read it out. But if some lucky individual wants to unmute and ask a question, or use the hand is a good idea. Shiraz, you were first with the hand, so you get the pleasure of asking your question first.
Grady, thank you very much. Big fan, and thanks for your voice console on social media and everywhere. Appreciate that. A question for the Google was that despite their scale, etc., they keep explaining what did they do wrong to U.S. Congress around privacy, interference in elections, etc. So that was what my question earlier was, that what they could have done better to prevent the security, privacy, and related issues which Google, Facebook, etc. keep explaining to U.S. Congress that we are trying to handle it, we are unable to handle it, this and that. To me, that is a scale question and very relevant to the architecture.
Sure. So let me talk about Facebook in particular, because I have been quite vocal about it. What could Facebook have done differently? They could have hired, or at least brought in, a mature CEO who cares about ethical issues and is not himself an unethical person. As I have often said, Facebook is a profoundly unethical company, and it starts at the top with Mark. So a lot of the issues I think that Facebook faces is, frankly, Mark doesn't care. And when you have an organization that doesn't care about those things, no amount of architectural work is going to make a difference. I have many stories of where actively they have resisted efforts that their developers knew would make a difference. That's hard to do. How do you deal with that? You quit the company. So I wish I could give you a bigger answer, but you know, in those kinds of issues, when software impacts, when software moves itself into the interstitial spaces of society, then it's no longer a technical issue, it's a social issue.
Awesome, thank you for the question. Hussein, you have your hand up.
And if anybody there for Facebook, I'll let you know where my lawyer is if you wish to sue me, but I've said these things.
Thank you very much for this conversation. It's been very good so far. I just wanted to ask a question from more of a consulting side. So I've been a consultant for quite some time. And as an architect, we do find ourselves going through that agile design where we design a system that we have to tweak, reconfigure, add components, remove components, etc. And we keep an eye on technical debt because as we are putting it together, we understand some of that will need to be redone. I'm getting a feedback. Thank you. Some of that needs to be redone, rethought out, replatformed even in some cases. And one of the non-technical things that sometimes comes up is from the business side, on the client side, that, hey, shouldn't this have been thought of from day one? So I often find myself coaching the clients on how architecture works, how the systems operate, and how the agile business is directly tied into the agile architecture. So what are y'all's thoughts on that, and any feedback and suggestions?
In Broadway.
Can I take that one real fast? David Levine,
in Broadway.
you can mute your microphone if you wouldn't mind. So let me take that one because this is another old story, an old world story. A dear friend of mine, Philippe Christian, who was the architect for the Canadian Air Traffic Control System and worked at Rational on a number of methodological kinds of things. He has written a great book, which I think may help you, and I just put the link for it here, Managing Technical Debt. Oh, okay. Well, whoever answered that question, sorry. Oh, I see, Diane. Got it. Thanks. I'll put that elsewhere. Anyway, yes, let me put that link in the right place. Sorry. Here it goes. And this is the book I would recommend you look at to answer all of your questions. You guys should get Philippe to talk here.
We are going to get that. Yes, absolutely.
Definitely. Yeah, I think maybe let me add to that. It has two major perspectives from my side. Yeah. So first of all, you can use architecture to make transparent, how architecture is supporting then the business goals. Yeah, this direct link or this connection, and you can bring that up to management where you say, look, if we do not focus on security performance or whatever, that's then the effect and on your business goals, for example. And the other perspective, as Grady mentioned, is technical debt. And although there's a lot of stuff available, I think from time to time they're still discussing this basic definition what technical debt really is. So from my point of view, it is really when you are consciously postponing a decision. That you, for example, do not do something on your architecture right now, but you will do that later. And that again needs to be communicated to management as early as possible, because otherwise, and a lot of companies struggle with that, they struggle to finance then some refactoring activities, dealing with technical debt and so on later, because then exactly as you mentioned, then the question pops up, like, so why did you do that before? So first, use the architectural methods to bring that up, to link that to the business goals, and use specifically this technical debt management practices, to deal with technical debt.
Yeah, on technical debt, just a thought. I mean, I think sometimes the businesses, if not educated carefully, could use it almost as a, let's just put everything to, as a way of ignoring some of the recommendations. Oh, we'll just park that as technical debt, we'll just park that as technical debt. So I think the trick is, and it's a difficult one, is, and I think people said that in the chat as well, is to be able to explain that in a language that the business can understand, and then you can communicate with them. We're doing this because of that. We're delaying that. If we keep on doing that, this will be the system will go down, something else will happen, or it will be much more costly, whatever it is. And I think that just dialogue and making all our decisions both explicit and also understandable to our business colleagues is Hussein, is not an easy thing to do. But I think sometimes it's much easier to ignore that and just, have a meeting go on your own, the separate paths, as long as the meeting's fine, everyone is happy, right? But it should be a constant dialogue.
Thank you.
Points. Up next, we have Stuart Clark. You asked a question in the chat. Would you like to unmute and ask it yourself? Otherwise, I can ask it on your behalf. I'll give you a few seconds. Going once, going twice. Alrighty. Now I find the question. So, question from Stuart Clark. Are there things which you see many organizations doing which they consider to be good architecture, but in fact is causing more pain? Thinking of things like documentation, or maybe the introduction of microservices.
For me, it's the issue of microservices.
You're first.
Yeah, for me, it's the issue of microservices. People are saying, oh, let's rush into it. But as I mentioned, forgetting the meta issue that the decision of what microservices they have is an architectural decision unto itself. That's the biggest one.
And I think it's similar to that, Grady. It's like some of the challenges sometimes is that, sometimes the architectures we like to develop are a reflection of the fads we see in the industry. It could be, pick your top favorite 3 technologies, and then you probably, and we, I have seen that a lot of like systems, that newer systems just incorporate them probably when they might not even need to. And microservices is a very good generic example of that. But I think that's a general, technology first without thinking, is it really required, is a big challenge.
In my mind, it's modeling and documentation without having a clear picture for what reason you are doing that. Yeah, so typically it's let's say good practice, yeah, to focus then your modeling and your documentation with some reasoning behind that. Yeah, why you want to, for example, use the modeling to do some analytical models on top of that. Yeah, but do not document for the sake of documenting that. Yeah, and that's the same is true for modeling. Yeah, and I see that quite often. That people focus then on documentation and modeling without having a clear picture when will each part of that be used by whom. Yeah.
Stefan, if I can add on to that, it is the ultimate irony for me, probably Ivar and Jim as well too, to see Amazon rediscovering the importance of visual modeling. Take a look at their AWS notational language, and they have basically reinvented UML deployment and component diagrams using their own notation. So modeling is dead, long live modeling.
Amazing, thank you for the answers. Maybe time for one more question. If anyone has one, feel free to unmute and ask, or raise your hand. Going once.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yes, we can.
Hello, everybody. This is Jürgen from Dresden in Germany. Hello. I would like to get back to the issue of the design decisions through frameworks. When we look at software that evolves over time, then obviously the type of framework or stack we would use for a certain system changes over time as well. So either we go for the one we might have chosen in 10 years, or we go for the one that we use right now. But looking at that kind of evolution, shouldn't we design systems in a way that allow us to port or migrate our softwares from one framework or one stack to another in advance? So be kind of independent from the overall framework. On the other hand, as Grady said before, those kind of frameworks are sticky. Yeah? So once you decide to go for AWS, you're locked in there. So how could we handle that?
I would also like a unicorn. So I'm sympathetic to your point. That I'd love to be able to say, I'm going to choose this particular graph database and not be bound to it so I can change it out. Problem is, it is the Roach Motel. Once I've gotten into it, how do I get away? If I choose to go to a Mac versus a PC, iOS versus Android, man, you've gone down the slippery slope. And that's, I don't know how to get out of the way. If I had an answer, then I would own the island that I see right now.
but in the end, the only thing that is left is to re-implement everything at some stage. Isn't that the case?
Unless you're the IRS and running.
yeah. Why is the IRS spent multiple billions of dollars trying to implement things? That's right. As I said in my Twitter feed once, I think we will see code that still exists long after the heat death of the universe. So, yeah.
Jürgen, I think what is important that you don't use then the framework, or as Grady mentioned, this architectural pattern of microservices without having, let's say, a clear view on that. What are the design trade-offs here? Yeah, what quality attributes are supported in which way? Yeah? And you should build some sort of conceptual layer on top of your framework that you say, okay, I have this user experience framework today, and this has the following trade-offs, the following patterns. And if the version changes, for example, you need some checkpoint here to check, for example, against your requirements. Is this new version, for example, still working with me, or is the change so massively that I need to think of, I don't know, exchanging, encapsulating, or whatever? But to having this dedicated conceptual layer and not taking some pattern or solution or framework blindly, that's the major point from my perspective here.
I want to celebrate what Peter has stated in the chat, and Diana commented on as well, that, you know, the fundamentals are still fundamental. And so the ideas of layering, the ideas of coupling and cohesion, which Larry Constantine brought to us literally decades ago, those concepts still apply. There's a book called Fundamentals of Software Architecture. I love the authors dearly, but I disagree with their premise in which they say there are no fundamentals of software architecture. There are, and the ideas of layering and coupling and cohesion, concepts that we have known from systems engineering for literal decades, those are fundamental and those don't change no matter what the latest fad is.
Yeah, agreed.
Everything else is a simple matter of programming.
Thank you for the question and answers. I'm going to be generous and say, Rudy, would you like to unmute and ask your question? I can see your hand up.
Yes, I had a question. Let's say circling back to UML and having those founding fathers in the chat, in the presentation over here. The level of detail versus the selectivity of the viewpoints you're using and the languages that exist today, for instance, like Archimate, they all tend to circle back to, okay, model visually. And how do you see the future of that towards the level of detail versus the, let's say, the plethora of viewpoints? That's a question I've been asking myself on how far, how deep should you go with this?
The general rule I apply is that, well, first the aphorism being the code is the truth, but not the whole truth. So what I apply to your question is, if a design decision is easily visible in the code itself, then that's a detail I don't worry about, but I make manifest in the code. Anything else, design decisions that transcend the code, design patterns that cut across multiple elements of code, those are the kinds of things that I do continue to document because they are not part of the whole truth that the code itself captures.
Well, great. Just some thoughts from my side. I mean, I'm a very visual person, and I used to be a big fan of visual modeling and UML, obviously. But I personally have gone away from this common notation view just because just seeing that it's just it doesn't work over time. People come, people change, and I think back to Grady said, it's really about, you know, what do you see in the code, or the running platform is most important, some way of documenting something else. And the problem with standard notations is that lots of architecture, as we said before, is about communicating. It's about telling a story to your stakeholders, whoever they are. You know, it could be business, other technologies, etc. And no one notation does that, right? So, you know, if you know, I've seen people try to present Archimate diagrams, and even to other technologists, they kind of don't understand it, right? Someone has to explain it to them. So things should be able to be explainable on their own. So personally, even though I'm a big fan of visual things and modeling, I like it as an individual, but I think imposing it widely on an organization is probably not fair.
I think keep in mind then the reason for modeling or documenting that. Yeah, and typically, as Grady said, it's so some decisions are in the code. Yeah, so there's no reason, for example, to document that twice. Yeah. However, there might be an overall structure and overall design decisions which are not really embedded in code, and you need to bring those up. And it might be the reason for communicating that. It might be that you're applying some analytic method on top of that, yeah, to reason, for example, why a quality attribute can be met or cannot be met. That would be my way forward. And the language, yeah, so you mentioned Archimate, yeah, so I've worked with Archimate on enterprise architecture level. Yeah, so I think it's a great language, yeah, a great meta model behind that. But I'm also working on, let's say, solution architecture level then with the UML, particularly with the catalysis approach, yeah, which is, I don't know, from 2000 and something, but still really good approach to model architectures.
just as a reference, I would recommend people to look at what Simon Brown has done with C4 and just the modeling approach. I think that's something we don't have time to go into now, but is quite useful to look into as well.
Great, thank you so much. We've got one more hand up, so I hope we have time for one final question. And Vishal, you are the lucky individual. Would you like to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Nabil. I hope you guys can hear me. First of all, I like to thank Grady, Murat, Stefan for all these helpful information and sharing your knowledge. Thanks a lot. I have a question. Like most of the time I have seen like the companies, so-called startups, start building some idea and they go very fast. They do release a lot of things in the initial phase, and maybe they do have some architectural things in their mind. But let's say after a certain time, it looks like the initial architecture, what they have thought of, it's no longer valid, or maybe it doesn't look really reasonable, and things might get difficult in the future. Maybe when it's a startup, it looks pretty easy and pretty straightforward, but as and when we keep adding the features, it becomes more complex and complex. So what do you guys suggest? Like, how should we take the approach of evaluating the architecture, what we actually have, and as we progress, how frequently we should revisit and validate, is it still a valid one or not? And in case if we find any difficulties, how should we handle those things? I mean, it's quite difficult to take a decision, but what do you guys suggest?
Well, the thing about startups is that architecture is only important insofar as it lets that startup get to an IPO or be acquired. So their metrics for architecture are very different. Will this lead me to a buyout or going public? Everything else largely becomes immaterial to those startups. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's the way of capitalism. So yeah, you may find organizations that are in that place, but the reality is, what do you value? Am I trying to build an enduring organization, or am I trying to get past the first gatehouse that allows me to build that organization? This is why a lot of startups that I see, not everyone, a lot of startups that I see face that interesting dilemma. They've rushed to build something, they've introduced all sorts of technical debt, but all of a sudden they're successful, and now it's like, oh crap, I've got to actually keep doing this. That's hard. And I don't have an answer for that. Again, if I had an answer for that, I would own every one of the islands that I now see.
Yeah.
I would argue each investment company should have some strong architectural capabilities, because exactly what Grady said. So typically you see those investment companies buying some startup or investing in a startup without having any details on the architecture. And then they try to scale up or they try to integrate, and then suddenly all those architectural issues pop up. So therefore, I would generally say startups are a prime example to deploy an architectural practices, because you need to know, so what do I need for my MVP? However, what are the constraints? What is my technical debt, and so on. Whether they communicate that to a potential investor, that might be a totally different story. But they need to really keep an eye on architecture.
And Vishal, I'll take it back to one of the essential activities I mentioned, feedback loops, right? So evaluating the architecture is just another type of feedback loop, and it's really do it as frequently as possible, right? As it should be, it could be, triggers could be how you're dealing with your quality attributes, triggers could be, other factors, but it's just all about, it's not something you do and forget about. But obviously big decisions like cloud provider or framework or etc., they stick around for a while.
And by the way, that's a similar situation in M&A scenarios. So when you, for example, if you do some due diligence, and you get an idea of the IT landscape of the application, you want to get an idea of the architecture behind that, because otherwise, if you buy just a black box here, you might be in trouble later.
Thank you.